Hear this paraphrase of a familiar passage. Jesus went into the mountains with his disciples, and he began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." And Peter said, "Will this be in the test?" And Philip said, "Were we supposed to write this down?" And James said, "I haven't got a pen." And Bartholomew said, "Did the other disciples have to learn this?" And Judas said, "When will we ever need this in real life?" And some Pharisees came to Jesus and said unto him, "May we see your lesson plan?" Was the learning objective clearly communicated to all students? Was there a range of differentiated outcomes according to the identified levels of ability of each student? Can you show that you have used a variety of teaching strategies according to the different learning models? And Jesus wept. In the church, too, we have a lesson plan, although it may not look like it a lot of the time. This is a Sunday with an ecumenical theme, the World Week of Peace in Palestine and Israel. We are asked to be aware of many issues. We're asked to be aware of Palestine, Afghanistan, Indian residential schools, Black Lives Matter, homelessness in Victoria, and the impact of the Delta variant. How do we process all of these inputs that are important? I'd like to suggest that each of us creates a primary narrative. That is the story that we construct for ourselves to make sense of everything. Because it's not possible to be aware of everything at the same level all of the time. We create a narrative, our own story, our own filter, to fit those important things into it. This is the role of a primary narrative, the story we construct to make sense of things. Now, what is your primary narrative like? For some people, they came to Canada as an immigrant and they struggled such and such to get established, and they began to raise a family and they live in Gordon Head. But your primary narrative might revolve around your job. I'm a nurse, or I'm a policeman, or I'm a teacher. Or your primary narrative might be all about being a parent or an involved grandparent. And these days, there seem to be enough people around whose primary narrative is politician. The issue becomes, is our primary narrative a closed box that we have carefully constructed and hermetically sealed? Or is it somewhat porous, and although it has a focus, it allows for change and adaptation and some new elements? And what does happen if your primary narrative clashes with someone else's? The primary narrative is what makes home for us. Not just a house or whatever dwelling we might live in, but it makes for us a kind of spiritual and human home. When I was growing up as a child, I lived on a small mixed farm in eastern Ontario in the rather boggy lands east of Cornwall in Glengarry. And every fall, we had a visitor to our small farm. I think his name was George, but he came from the Akwesasne Mohawk Reserve, not far away on Cornwall Island. Now, when George would visit with us, he would tell about the time when the Mohawk people used to live on these lands. And indeed, the legal description of our farmland said that it was lots 15 and 16 in the 16th concession of Indian lands. And I had never thought about that name until George came to visit. And it was the first inkling that my primary narrative, small boy growing up on farm looking after ducks being pests, needed some expansion. And it might even clash with someone else's, because we had not owned that farm or lived on that land forever. It just seemed that way to a small child. A primary narrative contains certain values and a simplified view of the world that may have to evolve in light of circumstances. Jesus told parables as a way of inviting his hearers to change their primary narrative, to contain the values of the kingdom of God, laid out in the Sermon on the Mount, which I partially paraphrased earlier. The good news is meant to shape our primary narrative in whatever time and place that we live in now. Now, there are different types of primary narrative. There is the personal one, and mine ran something like, well, I was a farmer's son and lived on the land until we were 16, and we moved to the city, and I went to school and university and became a minister and did that work for 35 years and retired, and now I'm the volunteer gardener at First Met. Not all primary narratives are from rags to riches. Your primary narrative will run something different from that. But there is a memory, a story that you tell to your children and your grandchildren, and you use that story to remind yourself of who you are, and how you fit in, and how you get along. And that's your primary narrative. There is also a primary narrative that we can have as a community. Now, here in Victoria, our primary narrative might be something like, well, this is a West Coast piece of jolly old England, where old people go to visit their parents. However, when we tell this primary narrative as a community, and we point out that we have homeless people and people dying of drug overdose and addiction, these realities intrude into that rather stylized primary narrative. And it can annoy some people. If you doubt that that intrusion is annoying, just read the letters to the editor and the Times columnist at any time, and you will find out how annoyed people get when things happen that violate their primary narrative. There is also a national primary narrative. It runs something like, well, Canada is a nation of Boy Scouts and Girl Guides, where everyone is polite, and our history has been harmonious, filled with nice people just like us, or not. And elections are about candidates selling a primary narrative that will be attractive to us, that we can identify with, that the primary narrative that they're selling and marketing and offering to us reinforce and will strengthen our primary narrative. However, we have in that idealized primary narrative of Canada the reality, perhaps only recently realized, of Indian residential schools and what it means to have a colonial past built on the notion of conquering people and exploiting people and land and resources. And so how does all of that awareness change the national narrative? And are we open to changing and adapting our narrative to new learned realities when our primary narrative conflicts with the narrative of others who have lived here perhaps longer than us? We also have a primary narrative to look at the world. And in that primary narrative, for us, Canada is usually depicted as a great peacekeeper. who has been called along the way to change the primary narrative from peacekeeper to peacemaker. Peacekeepers go to places where people agree that they're in conflict and they want a referee and are willing to honor the referee. Peacemakers are sent to places that are still in conflict and the combatants have no desire to get along harmoniously, and so there is a peace imposed by force. Our national narrative conveniently leaves out justice for Palestinians, the theme of our worship today, perhaps because the Israeli occupation and colonization of Palestine uncomfortably resembles the Canadian occupation and colonization of the northern part of North America. We don't usually see it as a colonization movement, or at least if you went to school when I did or earlier, that understanding of it all was not presented. Our national narrative is that of a peacemaker, but we do sell arms to oppressive regimes. And our motives in many of these transactions are very mixed. It is human nature for us to create primary narratives. That's not wrong. That's how we get along in a complex world. We need to have a primary narrative in order to filter all of those inputs that come towards us and to tell us what is important and what we will cherish and hold at the center, to make sense of the complexity of our world and to help us navigate our way. The book of Deuteronomy records the primary narrative of the Israelites as a people. God would give them a homeland from the Euphrates to the Western Sea, that would be understood as the Mediterranean, and from the wilderness of Palestine north to Lebanon. Literally, that would today be parts of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, Gaza, and all of Israel, Palestine. Those would all be included in those boundaries if you were to take that passage literally. In fact, that primary narrative would be used by hardline Israelis as a mandate to conquer Palestine in the 20th century and to refute any claim by others to live there. In this primary narrative, Palestinians are intruders and don't belong to the narrative. They are not us. Now, other Israelis and Palestinians are in effect saying that the primary narrative of Israel and Palestine can change to make room for a peaceful house where both peoples can build a home in which all are welcome. That's a different primary narrative than rule and conquer and occupy. A more complete narrative would see both Palestinians and Israelis having a sacred relationship with the land. But the details of that narrative are yet to be written. A changing and expanding a primary narrative can be threatening and controversial, whether in Palestine, Israel, or in Canada. It is threatening and controversial for those who like their primary narrative to be unchallenged. It's easier to leave the messy and painful parts out of the narrative, whether it's our own personal narrative or our narrative as a community or a nation. Jesus upset the Pharisees and those who upheld the temple establishment because his parables and his inclusion of outsiders in his healings and in his fellowship proclaimed a new primary narrative. That primary narrative he called the kingdom of God. The gospel is about letting God, through the teaching of Jesus, shape and refine our primary narrative. We must be self-aware that we have created a primary narrative and be aware of what's in it. And be aware that the narrative we live is not exclusively ours alone. We are called to be, in the narrative, a people of God. God is with us. We are not alone. Thanks be to God. This is our narrative.